Welcome to another episode of the EPS podcast where everything is a primary source. I'm Eric Paul. I'd like it very much if you could visit us on our website, epspodcast.club. You can also find us, perhaps even how you're listening right now, on all of the different listings where you'll find your favorite podcasts. We're also can be found on Patreon. Don't forget to hit subscribe, like, give as many stars as you please, as many as are offered. If there's an offering of 5 stars, please give this podcast 5. If there's 27 stars offered, same thing. Last time, the topic was a 1973 movie of Robin Hood, the animated feature. Today's topic is another movie in which a lot of the characters dress sort of like Robin Hood, and that would be 1940's Northwest Passage, Book 1, Rogers Rangers, starring Spencer Tracy. This movie is one of several that, while growing up, my dad turned on the TV and said, we're going to watch this movie, and I wasn't exactly sure what to expect. I wasn't sure if I was going to like it. It was an old movie then, and it, still is even older now, and I said to myself, I don't know, this looks kind of old and not really all that exciting. The main hook for me, though, was that we had just moved from the seacoast of New Hampshire, where the movie begins, the story begins, and found our way up on the shores of Lake Champlain, and that's where the movie, as its climax, is just north of Lake Champlain, because it chronicles the real 1759 St. Francis raid, which was led by Major Robert Rogers, the leader of the Rogers Rangers Commando Unit from New Hampshire, and they struck against an Abenaki village, which was in New France, Quebec. This is where a number of raids against New England villages in northern New England had been launched from, and as part of the French and Indian War campaigns, the British Ranger units, the British commanded, I should say, it was Robert Rogers is native to America. He was a New Hampshire militiaman, and that's where he formed his Rangers. He was used, as his soldiers were irregulars. They were used to covertly conduct a sneak attack. And as the story goes, and as the movie shows, getting to St. Francis was one thing that had its own challenges, going across Lake Champlain covertly, secretly, but getting back to Fort Number 4 on the Connecticut River was something else entirely. It took weeks. It was the commandos were facing lots of starvation and bitter cold, and it was just an awful, awful mess. But once it was completed, it was considered to be a great success. And in 1759, when the British were fighting the French on all corners of the world, including in North America, they were desperate for any kind of success to celebrate. But that is something that seemed to have lost in a lot of American history, especially since the fact that a few years later, during the Revolutionary War, Robert Rogers, who had been a loyal soldier for the king, originally supposedly offered his services to George Washington, but Washington rejected him out of fear that he wasn't really sure of his loyalties, for one thing, but also that he had heard that Rogers had become really unreliable thanks to his alcoholism. And it was not long afterwards that Rogers actually went to London, and that's where he spent the rest of his days, passing away in relative obscurity. And there are a few other times that Rogers has shown up in media, most recently a couple years ago in a series on television called Turn, Washington Spies. They make him a rather big character and take some liberties as far as, well, among other things, his accent. They make him seem very Scottish, and they also, I think, overstate his presence in America during the Revolutionary War and his sway. It is, some accurate depictions in that show that his Rangers transformed into the Queen's Rangers. during the Revolutionary War and were an irregular unit that fought against the Continental Army during that Revolutionary War. Well, move ahead to 1930s America as we approach the turn of the decade to 1940, and Northwest Passage, the movie, comes out. And this is where I'm going to now break down what this movie looks like when treated like a primary source of the era. Just like anything else, a letter, a article of clothing, a personal item, a book, a diary, anything that is from a time period, including movies, including movie posters, memorabilia, scripts, everything like that, they count as primary sources. They tell us something about the time period, and in this case, the late 1930s in America. So the first question that's always asked is, what material is this made from, and or how was this made? Well, this was a movie that was based on a book that had come out only a few years earlier by Kenneth Roberts. Now, this is going to be confusing talking about Robert Rogers and Kenneth Roberts, but I'll just briefly indicate that Kenneth Roberts had by that point written a number of history books. He was a journalist. He was a writer. He'd written a number of things before Northwest Passage. In fact, the movie poster always has a subtitle: Northwest Passage, Book 1, Rogers Rangers. And there was never a movie version of Book 2. In fact, the Northwest Passage, the book that was written by Roberts, sometimes is in two parts. Other times it's just one long book, with the saga of the St. Francis raid being just the first part of it. And it follows a character by the name of Langdon Town. He is a fictitious character that's from Kittery, Maine, which is just over the Piscataqua River from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And he has a number of adventures. And this is something that Roberts had actually become known for in his history writing. His historical fiction is that he was tackling subjects that were either unknowns, or in the time of the Revolutionary War, when he wrote a couple books about the expeditions of Benedict Arnold into Quebec. He uses Arnold, and who eventually becomes synonymous with treason later in that conflict. He uses him as the protagonist, and in other stories he has other loyalists as the main characters of his book, which is something very odd perhaps for the time period of the 1930s. We'll get to that a little bit later, as far as maybe it wasn't so odd or out of place, but that's what this story is based on. So the real life events of 1759, but also then the book which chronicles it as a novel, as a story. The movie was made very expensively, in fact, and it was something that MGM had put together for a pretty large sum of money, and all told they ended up losing money. Now, part of the reason why it cost a lot of money was because its star, Spencer Tracy, his contract, his being in movies had turned into gold for MGM, and so he was pretty expensive to get to be as the draw for a lot of movie fans in any of his movies, including this adventure film. That was one reason why it was so expensive. Another reason was it was in Technicolor, and this was actually Spencer Tracy's first Technicolor movie. And the location shooting, they didn't film it in New England or Quebec. It was actually filmed in Idaho, but moving any kind of large-scale production outside of the studios in Hollywood was always going to cost a lot of money. And so it was a big risk-taking as far as hoping to make a big score, but recent history had shown that plenty of historical pictures had made quite a bit of money. Now, all of this, what it tells us about the 1930s is that, well, as far as a book turning into a movie, that wasn't anything new by the 30s. Remarkably, Hollywood was still in its relative infancy. We look back on that time period and refer to it as the golden age of Hollywood in retrospect, but it was proving itself to be the favored form of entertainment for most Americans. It's always something where people say, well, a movie based on a book, what was better, the book or the movie? And a lot of times I think we mistakenly think that turning a book directly into a movie so quickly is a modern thing. It really wasn't. There's a future podcast I hope to do about something to do with The Great Gatsby, and that's a movie, or excuse me, that's a book that's been translated into movies several times, including immediately following its release in the mid-1920s. And it really, for that story, it really matches up well that a book which at its foundation is things about greed and envy, that they would cash in immediately on its popularity. And that trend tended to continue, that if a book did well, it was assumed that the movie would do just as well, if not better, because books, of course, rely on literacy, and movies don't. And so if you have an audience that either doesn't have time to read a book, or in the case of young kids, can't read, at least not at the level of the book is written, or, considering it's just easier to pack in a story in a couple hours rather than over the course of a week or a month, however long it takes to read some of these dense novels, then that tells you something about the length of time that people had to commit to making movies or to watching the movies and learning about stories, and that Hollywood was well informed about how to compress stories and put them into palatable films on the big screen. Now, who made this movie? Like I said, Kenneth Roberts was the author of the book, and he participated in the original script. All told, there was about a dozen people that helped write the script, but the name that comes up the most as far as being given the most credit would be a man by the name of Lawrence Stallings. And Lawrence Stallings was himself a World War I veteran. He had been shot in the leg during the taking of a German machine gun position during that war, and he begged not to have it amputated, which it wasn't, at least not in the overseas in the hospital there. But when he eventually came back to the United States and tried to recover, his wound was not recovering well, and eventually his leg was amputated. So he actually was pretty well recognized in the movie industry and in the playwriting industry as being on one leg, even writing a play about it. He wrote a book called Plumes, which was it was a semi-autobiographical account, especially of his war days, which was eventually turned into, it was the inspiration for a movie by Northwest Passage's director 15 years before, called The Big Parade. And The Big Parade was directed by King Vidor, which, if there's ever a great name for a director or anything else, I think that this takes the crown. King Vidor was the director of Northwest Passage, and his status in society by the time that this movie is made, he is a well-respected director. He was on a short list of directors who was able to segue his craft from the silent pictures to the sound pictures. The year before, he had actually directed a couple of much of the black and white or sepia tone scenes from The Wizard of Oz. He was considered to be an actor's director. He really took a lot of care to make movies which pronounce the humanity of stories, and in a way, Northwest Passage is not his kind of movie. It has a lot of components to it that don't match up with descriptions of some of his other films. Like, for example, The Big Parade, back in 1925, is largely considered to be one of the best World War I movies, one of the most accurate depictions of that war, and inspired a number of other World War I or just in general war movies. And Northwest Passage, it's a war movie because it takes place during a war, but a lot of the actual combat can be put together, compressed in just a few minutes of the movie. It's really not his style. So Northwest Passage is more of an adventure film, sometimes even categorized as a western. It's not what you would expect out of a director with that kind of status, and perhaps that explains a few things. I can dig up in a little while, but for now, all of these people and what their various situations were or their status in society. This is something that, despite the Depression, mass media was still expanding. And maybe not even despite the Great Depression. It may have been because of the Great Depression, with especially things like the movies, which all told was actually very affordable for most people to go and see the movies. One of the reasons why the 1930s marked the beginning of the golden age of Hollywood is because they had a largely captive audience. At various points throughout the 1930s, when you had close to 25% unemployment, depending on when you're looking at things, and just an overall malaise in the society, you have a lot of people who are willing to seek out escape, if not with wild stories of history, or in the case of The Wizard of Oz, fantasy, or just wanting to be physically away from their situation by being in a darkened building for hours at a time and enjoying, especially in the cold, or excuse me, the warm months, the nice coolness of the air conditioning. This is something that I think says a lot as far as how the movie industry was really expanding in that time, and that the mass media itself, beyond just movies, things like books and periodicals, radio, of course, all of these things were just growing and growing in audience. People had a lot of attention on it. They were the lifeblood of the society at the time, and that's for certain. And the movie industry, like I said, was going very strong during the Depression era. The film was coming in from Kodak in Rochester, New York, and they were also filling the cameras of still images throughout the country. Some of the most famous photographs from the 1930s were prompted by federal government programs through the New Deal to try to chronicle and record Dorothea Lange's famous images of the Okies traveling across the country. Those all came from her project, which was to document for the Department of the Interior what things were like for the Dust Bowl victims. And so the visual arts, this was something that was highly regarded by all segments of society throughout the 1930s, whether it was a fun, exciting movie or a artistic presentation when it came to photographs or just features in the newspaper or the magazines. This was very much a part of the society and an extension of the print culture that had largely been established well before in the colonial period. In fact, going back to the historical figure of Robert Rogers, one thing that stands out about him is that nobody really knows what he looked like. There's only one publication, a very pretty famous print that you can find of Rogers, and it really could be anybody. It's a simple artistic depiction, and it was something that was made in London, and it was clear, just like so many of those mid-18th century illustrations, it was framed or just pinned to a wall somewhere in a coffee house or a tavern, so that when people were reading about his exploits or anybody else in the newspaper, they could match a face to a name. But there's really no clear way to know what Rogers looks like or looked like, even in his own time period. But the British American print culture, this desire for constant information, particularly with print media, whether it be visual or text, this continued easily well into the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and as depicted here with not only this movie, but the various advertisements that you see for Northwest Passage, the depictions of the movie on the movie poster form to try to get more people excited about it. So Robert Rogers was once again in poster form, this time looking a lot like Spencer Tracy. And for all we know, that's actually what he did look like. The next question is, why did they make it? Like I mentioned earlier before, there was a trend for history movies in the 1930s that, especially ones that pulled from America's past stories of resolve and especially in the face of adversity. And this was something that a lot of people in the Great Depression could fully understand. It is a misconception that everybody in the Great Depression was suffering to the same extent as the Okies or somebody who had lost it all in the crash of 1929 and was reduced to selling pencils on Wall Street. There's plenty of people throughout the country that got along all right, that were really relatively untouched by the Depression. But there was still a sizable number of the, if you were to put it all together and average it out, the American public was feeling the effects. And there was lots of messages throughout movies, particularly when deciding from historical time periods and events which ones to put onto the film. You have stories like Drums Along the Mohawk, which is a Revolutionary War era film about the New York frontiers and how those settlers out there were able to fight off one threat after another. That came out in 1939 based on a 1936 book. There's Gone with the Wind, which was made again on a 1936 book by journalist turned writer Margaret Mitchell, and depicts, just like Northwest Passage, an unlikely perspective, an unlikely hero in a Southern belle turned voracious Reconstruction warrior, for lack of a better term, perhaps even a scalawag, using the time period's language, in Scarlett O'Hara. And that's something that a lot of people, it's pretty clear to see in 1939 how that story of adversity, overcoming barriers, doing what you can to look out for yourself. I will never go hungry again, she claims, or something along those lines. That is another reason why Gone with the Wind rings so true. San Francisco was another movie with Spencer Tracy and Gone with the Wind's Clark Gable, which talks about the earthquake earlier in the century in San Francisco. And of all the things that could happen at the end of that movie, the protagonists of it, after surviving the earthquake and the subsequent fires, link arms and sing the battle hymn of the Republic as they overlook the decimated city of San Francisco. A message of, we will get through this together. We will work together and get through it all. And so this was not uncommon. Northwest Passage was just another attempt at trying to steer audiences towards those kinds of stories, giving them messages about America's past. And I think that of all the tales that Kenneth Roberts could tell, this one matches up pretty well with that idea of overcoming obstacles and doing the best and having plans B and C and D just in case things happen, being proactive about things, following a leader that knows what they're doing and can think on their feet. This is something that is seen with the same year's Grapes of Wrath, with and that one is a little bit different, being that it's a contemporary story. It's taking place in the time period, but that's something else audiences get along with, and seeing how somebody like Tom Joad emerges as a leader of his family, of course, but even within the ranks of the other Okies that he encounters when they get to California. This is a message that seems to recycle itself throughout the era. And I really think that that's why they made it. And these movies would not have been successful without audience response. And so trying to continue that trend of having these big epic features of The Big Parade or Gone with the Wind, where audiences were moved, they turned emotional, it meant something to them, it inspired them. That's very telling of the time period and the audience that we're working with. The next question is, where was it made? Like I mentioned before, they filmed most of the movie in Idaho. And what locations are associated with this source? Well, it starts out in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It finds its way across New Hampshire, the New Hampshire land claims, which later became known as Vermont, and up Lake Champlain, which is between Vermont and New York and goes up into Quebec. And I also want to include in this, because one of the posters that I'm looking at the most with this one would be a series of Australian advertisements for the movie, for its release in that country, which depicts Spencer Tracy holding on to a Union Jack British flag. And so all of these locations are associated, particularly the first ones I mentioned. And this is something that Kenneth Roberts, as a Kennebunkport native from Maine, Kennebunk, at least Kennebunk, I'm not sure if it's Kennebunkport, but Kennebunk, which is just nearby. This is a coastal Maine city. And as the old saying goes, write what you know. He wrote a number of his stories based in and around this part of New England that he's from and where I'm broadcasting from. And so this is, with the associated locations. I see a lot of this as him almost filling the gaps with his stories. Instead of telling a tale about the siege of Boston or the Battle of Bunker Hill during that siege, or Saratoga, or the bigger battles in the Revolutionary War or the time leading up to it. What all this tells me, particularly with the Australian connection, is that, well, among other things, Australia's development was similar to what the trajectory looked like for America in the 1750s when this story takes place. Australia and even Canada have sort of a alternate history version of what would have happened had the United States not waged a war for independence starting in 1775. And so I feel that the decision to market the movie in such a way to try to get Australian audiences interested by showing them a figure from North America that perhaps they could relate to, because their own history picking up in the early 19th century and developing into beyond just a commonwealth into a sovereign federation in the early 20th century was something that would appeal to Australian audiences by 1940. And of course, there is the ominous nature of the Second World War, which I will address very shortly in this podcast. But the next question that needs to be asked is, who is the intended audience or user of this? When it comes to a movie poster, for example, the intended audience of it is movie audiences. This would be put up all around town, especially near a movie theater, before the movie was released, and of course while it was playing, to try to attract people. And that's why the artwork that you see on all these different posters tries to communicate as much as possible in as little images as you can, just to make sure people get the gist of it, know who the stars are, know what the general kind of movie it is, and will be likely to come to see it. The movie does have a few slight elements of a romance story in it, but really nothing enough to make it such a wide interest for everybody. I think the most people that would go see it would be adventure film fans, and that would be young men, most likely kids, boys. That's who was most interested in all of the countries that this movie was released, and that's who it was mainly geared for. There wouldn't be much for a family to go see or a couple. It was certainly not something that appealed to a lot of the female viewers, and I don't think it necessarily intended to. And that's something that I think eventually hurt its box office draw. It was very popular with the audience that it was intended for, but not enough people went and saw it because to match up with the very expensive nature of the film. And so what that tells us of the 1930s, among other things about the audience and the demographics interested in it, is that the movie industry was perhaps still learning its ways. It didn't have enough to look back on and say, well, we marketed it poorly, or we didn't do this right, or we should do that next. There was still a lot of trial and error. Although the 30s and the early 40s mark the golden age, Hollywood was still a pretty novel form of industry. It wasn't something that had really been through a lot of major challenges just yet. It was still a few years off from television dominating, and it didn't have as much of a trial as by fire as it would in the coming years once television becomes a major threat to its bottom line. So now the ideas and behavior that it conveys. What does this movie and the posters, what does it all say? Well, there's an obvious Anglo-American cooperation message that starts almost immediately with the movie. In fact, in the opening credit scenes, the music that's covering it eventually transitions over into the sound, the music of God Save the King. The melody to that music is familiar to most Americans, definitely by the 1940 as My Country 'Tis of Thee. But it doesn't make sense that a movie that's set in 1759 would have a song that wasn't given those lyrics until much later. God Save the King had come out in 1747. It was a number one hit of 1747, and it was something that became eventually an anthem of the British Empire. And so by segueing over from its movie music to just when the movie's about to open up and show the wide view of the city of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, with the Boston to Portsmouth stage arriving in to town, by segueing over into God Save the King, there's a message right there, right away, of the relationship that's not only depicted in the movie and was true in the time period of a strong bond between North America and the mother country of Great Britain, but one that perhaps should or could still exist. The Australian ad features the Union Jack prominently displayed, being held aloft by Spencer Tracy's character of Robert Rogers, which doesn't actually ever happen in the movie. However, throughout the movie, Robert Rogers communicates with and has good interactions with his British officer peers. In fact, in reality, he was good friends with General Amherst, who you see in the movie giving him his orders to go and attack the fort, or from Fort Crown Point all the way up to St. Francis. And not only is this accurate to history, but it also gives the movie a great opportunity to show Americans dressed in their green fatigues, as Robert Rogers and his Rangers are all wearing. They kind of look like Peter Pan or Robin Hood a little bit. The real Rangers wouldn't have worn quite something like that. They would have had normal looking 18th century soldiers' uniforms, but they would be in greens and browns and darker colors to blend in with the woods and the forests that they traveled through and they ranged in. But this movie gives us an opportunity to see the Rangers lined up on one side and red-coated British regulars on the other, facing each other, not as adversaries, but as friends. And this is something that was enormously important, apparently, for the filmmakers to get across to its various audiences, particularly in the United States, that amounts to essentially World War II propaganda. So throughout the 1930s, with so many movies depicting Americans throughout history overcoming hardships similar to what people were experiencing financially with the Great Depression, by 1940, and by 1939 before it, overseas in Europe, a second world war, had already erupted. In fact, by 1940, the Battle of Britain had commenced. And even though the United States had been partnering with the British through the Lend-Lease project, the cash and carry policies of supplying the British with ammunition, with ships, with tanks, everything that they could to fight the war, by and large, Americans were still very trepidatious about committing to entering another world war, especially since all of the travesties and tragedies that had resulted from the First World War. Interestingly, depicted very well by the director King Vidor in the movie The Big Parade, which was largely a story about the horrors of the First World War. So it's interesting that he may have taken part in World War II pro-alliance with Great Britain propaganda, that perhaps it's only a matter of time before the United States was to enter this conflict once again on the side of Britain and France into the Second World War. And so I think that this is one of the things that endures the most from this picture. There's really, like I mentioned before, very little actual fighting. There is, on the other hand, a lot of building up to the fight and showing how the Americans and the British may very well be able to work together. We have a misconception a lot of times that the special relationship that existed between the United States and Great Britain began immediately following the Revolutionary War, or maybe at the latest after the War of 1812. While trade relations were on again, off again strong between the two countries, largely because of a shared heritage, shared language, and similar cultures, is not something that really was galvanized until later, and that was between Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill during the Second World War. So this movie does function, perhaps, as a way to encourage Americans to consider the virtues of having a strong relationship once again on the battlefield with Great Britain, and as depicted in movie form. As the World War went on and after the United States entered it, there's many more overt propaganda pieces. The United States Army contracted out with some of the best directors in Hollywood to create the Why We Fight series. There was the Fighting Sullivans, a story that was produced during the war to show how certain families were giving even more than others to the war effort, including their children, several brothers, and the end of that movie shows the Sullivan boys marching proudly with an American flag waving behind them. Those things, they seem almost comical now, but once again, it tells you something about how much movies impacted people's lives in the 1930s into the 1940s, that it was not quite the not quite a daily ritual, but it was such a regular visit for people to go watch movies that was the primary mechanism. That was the way that messages could be coming down from the top to try to get into people's consciousness. The final question that's asked with any primary source: is this prescriptive or descriptive? It's, of course, more prescriptive, especially if you focus in on the message it's sending about 1940 and not what it's saying about 1759. There is a difference between heritage and history. Heritage tends to be the special things, the highlighted things, oftentimes the good things about the past that people really want to build up and present. History is everything. History is just all of it. Good, bad, indifferent, that's just the past. Most movies, even if they're trying really hard to portray a realistic view of the past, and Northwest Passage really is not very realistic. It's pretty fictitious presentation of the way not only the Rangers appeared and behaved and talked, and even the way that Native Americans are portrayed. Not at all very accurate. The depiction, modern day interpretation of that raid. There's actually a number of more recent stories that talk about it, including I came across a children's book that was written from the Abenaki perspective of the St. Francis raid. And in that section of Quebec, Robert Rogers and his Rangers are portrayed far less than heroes. They're shown as villains for their carrying out of that particular attack. Movies are really poor attempts at being good secondary sources. Even the best and most accurate form of movie about history is always going to be influenced by what's going on around it in its own time. It's a product of its own time, and therefore is best used as a primary source of when the movie came out, and not necessarily of the time period in which it came, which it's about. So Robert Rogers did have a rebirth thanks to this movie. There's a lot of people who say, oh, Rogers Rangers? Yeah, Northwest Passage. I know that movie. I've seen it on the old movie channel. Or, if they're a bit older, they saw it when it was initially released, or perhaps later on when it was on television. And as I mentioned before, the character did return to the screen a couple of times. First in 1958, when they made a television series of the Northwest Passage story, the book, and it was portrayed on NBC as Robert Rogers and his Rangers. This time they did get to complete the second book. They never made it into a feature film, but it was made into a series for television in the 50s. And then again, later on, more recently, with Rogers being portrayed in the television show Turn. There's also, in New York State, in Fort Edward, there's Rogers Rangers Island, which is where you can visit. That's where it's the spiritual home of the Army Rangers. The Army Rangers still, at least for a time, would issue their Rangers at training the Rogers rules for ranging. That was something that he put together in the 1750s and is still adhered by. And during the French and Indian Wars, when Rogers had a training installation on Rogers Island, and if you were to visit that place in New York, you would see a number of artifacts, a museum, a visitor's center, but also a statue that was put in 2005. And I gotta say, I believe that his rebirth in 1940 as a function, as a agent of trying to attract people's attention to the growing war clouds or the erupting war clouds in Europe and how it was impacting the British, and that a time for another Anglo-American collaboration was afoot, has a lot to do with the way that Robert Rogers has been brought back up, because everything about the guy does not match up well with a American hero. He didn't fight for the United States during the War for Independence or at any other point afterwards. So it's an unlikely type character, but that seems to fit the time period of the 1930s and early 40s as far as what American audiences were interested in. Well, that is my attempt at trying to dissect this particular movie and its memorabilia, its merchandising. Considering I didn't have somebody else to bounce ideas off of, if you have any thoughts about this particular movie, anything at all that you think that perhaps I overlooked or missed, feel free to enter into any of the comment areas, whether it be on Podomatic, on the Facebook page that we have set up for the podcast, or any other place at all that you think I might see it. I have an email address, epspodcasthost@gmail.com. And if you have any ideas about this one or another one that you'd like to hear in the